Hello, and thank you again for your interest in studying Bible archaeology. During this segment, I'd like to examine the Roman practice of crucifixion. Although other ancient cultures hung bodies on crosses, and many times after the death, the Romans developed crucifixion into a most agonizing and torturous death. The author of Hebrews in chapter 12 and verse 2 says, "Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." We want to examine not only the physical endurance, but also the shame of the cross. When Jesus was in the garden praying before his arrest, before he was betrayed, Luke, the physician, is the only gospel writer to note in Luke 22, verse 44, "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." Luke here states a condition, blood sweat, or two Greek words that are put together, hematidrosis, literally blood sweat. An extremely rare condition where the blood excretes through the skin. This happens when a person is under extreme stress. The ancient Greeks were the first to record and had observed it in some soldiers before they entered into battle. It has also been witnessed on some death row inmates as their execution date nears. Jesus is shortly afterward arrested by the high priest and goes through at least 3 unjust trials during the night and finally brought to Pilate. When Pilate, the following morning, tries to release Jesus, Matthew records in chapter 27, verses 22 and 23, "And Pilate said to them, 'What shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?' And they all said, 'Let him be crucified.' And the governor said, 'Why? What evil has he done?' But they cried out all the more, saying, 'Let him be crucified.'" The crowd asked at least 3 times for Jesus to be crucified. These Jewish people were well aware of what crucifixion was. The Roman orator Cicero described crucifixion, a most cruel and disgusting punishment. The very mention of the cross should be far removed from a Roman citizen's body, from his mind, his eyes, his ears. Our English word excruciate comes from the Latin form of cross, C-R-U-X, and meaning to torment, to torture. And when someone says, "I have excruciating pain," originally that was in reference to one who had been tortured on the cross. However, before being crucified, we see that Pilate has Jesus scourged, as Mark records in chapter 15, verse 15. What exactly is scourging? Well, first of all, the victim would have been stripped of his clothing, and they would extend the arms up over their heads and bind the wrist with chains and affix them to a scourging post. In Rome, stone pillars have been discovered that served as scourging posts. When a trained legionnaire would use a phalangium, a Roman scourge whip, and I have one here, and this is a Roman scourge whip. The cords on this one perhaps should be a little bit longer, and it would typically have 3 weights up in here. Sometimes people think of a scourge whip as being something like the Egyptians used, and you see these carried by Egyptian pharaohs. But the Roman scourge whip would use a bronze piece. It's like a star. There are 6 points And this one came up at a recent auction. It has 6 points on one side and then 6 points offset on the other side. And the barb would slide between the lead weights. When swung, the barbs would penetrate the skin and stick due to the weight and the force of the blow, and then be pulled across the back. Many victims died during scourging. In this illustration, you can see the scourging post and the victim being strapped up upon that. Paul would have been scourged in the Fortress Antonio in Acts when he was arrested at the temple, but he said, "Is it lawful for you to scourge one who is a Roman?" Romans could not be scourged. Romans believed that a person that was guilty would eventually tell the truth during the act of scourging, and that they could not continue to lie. Mark says, following the scourging, and the soldiers led him away to the hall called Praetorium. And they called together the whole garrison and clothed him with purple and twisted a crown of thorns and put it upon his head and began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews." This passage demonstrates how the common soldiers were then in charge of the fate of the condemned. The purple signifying royalty, and the crown of thorns was not as much to cause pain, although it did inflict and probably caused him to bleed. But as we looked at this accusations, the Romans would crown their emperors and victorious generals with laurel-wreathed crowns. The Roman Senate honored Octavian Augustus with a bronze wreath crown that was placed over his doorway to his palace. To them, this emblem resonates victory, power, glory. All this Jesus would achieve over death and more, but first had to endure this mockery for our sins. Curiton in the first century wrote, "Without even seeing them or listening to their defense, he immediately ordered 16 cellmates to be crucified. They were duly brought out, chained together at foot and neck, each carrying their own cross." The executioners added this grim spectacle as penalty, as a deterrent to others so minded. And we see that that was written in the first century BC. John tells us in John 19, verse 17, "And he, bearing his cross, went forth to the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha." We see Mark also records that they compelled Simon, a Cyrenian who was passing by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Plutarch wrote in 100 AD, "Every criminal who goes to execution must carry his own cross on his back." And Artodordius in the 2nd century, "For the cross is like death, and the man who is to be nailed carries it beforehand." According to the 1st century historian Josephus, after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, crosses for the condemned Jews were olive trees, and the Romans had cut down olive trees beyond Bethlehem. A whole olive wood cross would have weighed over 300 pounds. The crossbeam would have weighed between some 75 to 100 pounds and was not as cumbersome. Dionysius, the 1st century BC writer, writes of crucifixion, "A Roman citizen of no obscure station, having ordered one of his slaves to be put to death, delivered him to his fellow slaves to be led away in order that his punishment might be witnessed by all. He directed them to drag them through the forum and every other conspicuous part of the city as they whipped him, that he should go ahead of the procession with the Romans that at the time were conducting in honor of their Roman god. The men ordered to lead the slave to his punishment, having stretched out both hands to a piece of wood which extended across his chest and his shoulders as far as his wrist, and followed him, tearing his naked body with whips. Mark 15:25, and it was the third hour, and they crucified him. Writings by Seneca the Younger tell us that victims that were crucified were completely nude, reminding us of the shame of the cross. Now, of all of the thousands of individuals that the Romans have crucified, there has only been one grave discovered of a crucified victim. Victims were left to rot upon the crosses and to be eaten by birds and beasts as a symbol to others of their subjection to Roman rule. Jehoian was a man put to death by crucifixion in the 1st century AD, and his ossuary, bone box literally, was found in 1968 when building contractors were working in a Jewish neighborhood in northeast Jerusalem. They accidentally discovered the tomb, and the Jewish stone ossuary had the Hebrew inscription of the man's name on there. Unfortunately, the evidence that we have is only of the right heel bone. As we see in this replica of the original, that the bone pierced through the back heel bone without breaking it, and it must have been nailed into an olive wood tree with a knot in it right there. Now, traces of olive wood were found on both sides of the nail, indicating that there would have been a wood plank on the other side. So it was not long enough, the nail, to pierce through both the wood and another foot. So there was only one heel bone that this was discovered on. Josias and Dr. Sickles, both working there in Jerusalem, examined the evidence. And in this particular case, it was concluded that this victim's feet straddled on either side an olive wood cross with a small board on the outside of both heels to keep them from sliding off the nail. And perhaps the hands near the wrist were attached in a somewhat similar fashion. The Gospels give us, from a perspective of witnessing the crucifixion of Jesus from a third-person perspective. However, the psalmist David in Psalms 22, through inspiration, gives us a first-person perspective of the crucifixion of Christ. And let's examine a few of those. Of course, it begins, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And why art thou so far from the words of my groaning?" Verse 16 says, "They pierced my hands and my feet." Verse 14 states, "And all my bones are out of joint." We do know from writings that some victims that were crucified, the soldiers would take and dislocate their shoulders to increase the pain and agony hanging from the cross. David writes in Psalms 22:18, "They look and stare at me, they divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." I have here a Roman gambling die, and I have studied and found that they would typically have carried 3 to use in their games. Gambling was a favorite pastime of the Romans, from legionnaires who would do it in their downtime to Caesar Augustus, who wrote in his own letters of his gambling losses. This particular one is made out of bone, and then here is a Roman gambling die with the number 4 on it. Die look much like they did then as they do today, only made from bone or brass or stone. I want to mention that crucifixion was a lethal form of death. This is capital punishment. All of the victims crucified, there is only notation of one ever known survivor. In the life of Flavius Josephus, as he wrote there, he writes of an encounter as they are crucifying victims there in Judea. And he says, "I saw many captives and remembered 3 of my former acquaintances. And I was very sorry at this in my mind. And with tears, with my eyes, I went to Titus. And I told him of my friends, and so immediately he commanded them to be taken down and to have the greatest care taken of them. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hands, while the 3rd recovered." I want to take a moment here and just refer to the Quran. In the Quran, it states that Jesus was hung on a palm tree as an act of crucifixion, and that when the apostles left, someone took Jesus off the cross, and they had supposed that he was dead, but he revived. And as we see here, you just didn't recover from crucifixion. The Romans preferred crucifixion as a capital punishment for non-citizens, not only because of the pain and suffering, because it could sometimes take days for the victim to die. As one hung, they could easily breathe into the lungs as they hung there. You could breathe in, but the air would be trapped. And to get the air out, one would have to push up on the legs upward to take the weight off the lungs to exhale. The ultimate cause of death would come from hypovolemic shock, in which there are 4 stages. And it is a loss of blood volume due to hemorrhaging and dehydration. There are 4 stages of the hypovolemic shock, and as one would go through the various stages, different parts of the body would phase out. The heart rate would increase, and therefore you would want to breathe more rapidly. And so it would cause you to want to push up and down to gain those breaths, and to speak would have been a struggle. The foot of the cross would not have been a pleasant place to be. Remember, Jesus had nothing to drink since the supper with the apostles. And there he stated there, "I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now until the day I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." In Matthew 26:29. Again, consider Psalms 22, verse 15. "My tongue clings to my jaws, and you have brought me to the dust of death." The psalmist in Psalm 69:21, the writer says, "They gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink." Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each record immediately one of them ran and took a sponge and filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and offered to him to drink. Matthew 27:48. The Greek word here for the sour wine, or oxos, was a Roman soldier's drink that they became accustomed to drink to tolerate and handle extreme marching conditions in battle, and it would keep them hydrated. This would have been readily available there at the cross because you have soldiers there. But how does a sponge get to the cross? I want to talk a bit, just a little, about Roman toilets. Roman latrines were set up so that there was a funny little hole in the seat. And there was a water channel that went around the edge of the latrine of clean water. And there would be buckets. And in the buckets would be a sponge on a stick. And the bucket was filled with vinegar, so you would use your Charmin and clean it in the trench and then return it to the bucket. However, a soldier's pack they carried their own sponge on a stick. This was no act of kindness, but additional humiliation to our Lord Jesus as they put that toilet paper filled with that vinegar up to his mouth to drink. Lucius Annus Seneca, the younger brother of Gallio, a Roman senator and proconsul of Achaia in 52 and 52 AD, he's mentioned there in Acts chapter 18. So Seneca writes, "Can anyone be found who would prefer wasting away in pain, dying limb by limb, or letting his life out drop by drop, rather than expiring once and for all? Can any man be found willing to be fastened to the tree, long, sickly, already deformed, swelling with ugly wheals on his shoulders and on his chest, drawing the breath of life amid a long, drawn-out agony? He would have many excuses for dying even before mounting the cross." In John chapter 19, verse 31, reads, "Because it was the day of preparation, the Jews asked Pilate that the legs be broken, that they could be taken away." The Romans, always prepared, had a special device for this called the carafragnium. It was an iron club specially designed that was heavy on one end and was designed that when swung, it didn't just break the bones. And when the shin bone would have been targeted, it would have shattered the bones. And once shattered, the legs were unable to push upwards, and the condemned would die in a matter of a minute or two. Then the soldiers came and brake the legs of the first and of the other who were crucified with him. But when to Jesus they came, they saw that he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Again, notate the precise details of the scripture that are fulfilled in Psalms 22:17, when the psalmist there writes, "I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me." We see in John 19, "But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out." The Legionnaire Spear was called a pilum, and we'll look at that in another segment. It was designed to be thrown once, and it would bend on impact, so that if you first missed your target, they couldn't throw it back against you. And then if it hit the shield, it would bend in the shield and render it useless. And we see that that pilum here at the cross, sometimes the soldiers would carry two, is probably thrust upward into Jesus' side. And then the psalmist writes, "My heart is like wax, it is melted within me," Psalms 22:14. There is a condition called myocardial rupture type 3. And where the portion of the heart wall there balloons into an aneurysm, and eventually this aneurysm burst. We don't know, but it could be possible that through the extreme punishment that Jesus endured on the way to the cross, he may have suffered some type of blow that damaged that. And through the agony upon the cross, it may have been such that his heart literally melted within him. We just don't know. But we do know that blood and water flowed out his side. Again, let's consider Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1 and 2. "Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God." Whenever you partake of the emblems of the Lord's Supper, and Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me," hopefully some of these things that we've talked about will help you remember Jesus giving that body freely, Jesus shedding that blood freely for my sins and your sins.